The night rain poured relentlessly over the Texas pines, as if the sky itself were mourning an invisible loss. In the thick darkness, heavy with the scent of damp earth and rotting leaves, each clap of thunder struck Jennifer Whittaker's chest like a drum, echoing the memory of battlefields now silent, where no bombs exploded, only silence reigned. She stood alone on the familiar cliff at the edge of Timber Ravine, her worn military coat clinging to her thin back, stiff with cold and resolve. Her flashlight had dropped to the ground, its dim beam barely illuminating her mud-caked boots. Everything felt ready. Memories of fallen comrades, sleepless nights waiting for explosions, and mornings she woke only to wonder why she was still alive. All had fused into a weighty verdict, leaving her hollow and breathless. Then, out of the gray veil of rain, a faint movement emerged on the trail. Quiet, almost invisible, yet Jennifer sensed it. It wasn't human footsteps, but a presence, cautious, hesitant, as if something were unsure whether it belonged in the human world. Amber eyes glimmered in the shadowed underbrush. Not fierce, not fearful, just watchful, like a creature long acquainted with danger. A small, lean figure, soaked and smeared with mud, stopped a few steps from her. It was a German shepherd, tall but gaunt, without a collar, without any mark of belonging. Like it, too, was wandering in search of refuge. Its once thick coat was now matted and dripping, with a long, healed scar twisting across its left shoulder. Its stance was sturdy, but trembled slightly in the cold. Yet those amber eyes, deep and unnervingly calm, locked onto hers without blinking, as if trying to read what she would do next. Jennifer didn't know why she didn't look away. At that moment she forgot the exhaustion gnawing at her bones. She forgot her hands, trembling from cold, and collapsed. She only stared back, drawn into that silent gaze. Something both fierce and gentle, as if the animal had seen things no one would believe it had witnessed. She dropped to a crouch, not as a command, but as a final surrender. Rain dripped from her soaked hair onto her lined cheeks. Still, the dog didn't move. It watched her, head slightly tilted, as if weighing its options. Then, without a sound, it stepped forward. Slow, deliberate, cautious, like a creature too long in the wild. And when it was only inches away, it stopped. Jennifer looked down and saw it place one front paw on the fallen flashlight. No growl, no whimper, just standing there, as if waiting for her decision. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe it was just shelter from the rain. But something in the way it didn't leave, in the way it showed no fear and claimed nothing, made Jennifer feel something she hadn't felt in years. A fragile thread connecting two wounded souls. She slowly reached out, her hand still wet and trembling, but there was no bite, no recoil. The dog lowered its head gently, accepting the touch from the only human left on that rainy night. And so, instead of letting go as she had planned, Jennifer quietly stood. One hand grabbed the flashlight strap, the other rested lightly on the dog's neck. It didn't resist. It simply walked beside her, their footsteps silent, like two strangers who had just signed an unspoken pact between life and pain. They turned their backs to the cliff edge, away from the dark, and made their way to the modest wooden cabin in the woods Jennifer called home. That night, Jennifer didn't sleep, but neither did she shiver from nightmares. In the silence, the animal lay at the foot of her bed, occasionally shifting and breathing evenly. At some point, she turned her head and saw those amber eyes still open, watchful, alert, and steady. Neither of them said anything, but both understood. They had found each other in the storm. She didn't yet know its name, and it didn't yet know how heavy her heart was. But that night, as the thunder faded and the rain began to ease, something small changed. For the first time in years, Jennifer was no longer alone. That rainstorm didn't just drench the Texas forest floor. It unearthed things inside Jennifer she thought were long buried. When Storm walked into the cabin, its footsteps careful, like a creature no longer trusting ease. She had no idea she had just opened the door to a quiet but profound change. Storm, the name she gave it a few days later, had no collar, no papers, and none of the eager responses people expect from a rescued dog. It didn't wag its tail, didn't leap with joy. It just lay by the front door, head resting on its front paws, eyes open, never looking away from her. In that gaze was a silence learned from experience, a silence that held no more hope and no resentment. The tear on its left shoulder had been stitched up long ago, crudely, the thread now dark as soil. Beneath its thick fur were countless small scars, each telling a story. None were natural, none were accidental. Jennifer realized this as she wiped the mud from its coat with a warm towel. At first, Storm flinched slightly, eyes narrowing, but it didn't growl or resist. It endured as if it had long since known the feeling of being touched without love. This was not the response of a stray. It was the instinct of something that had once been owned. In the first days at the cabin, Storm never entered the bedroom, never got on the bed, and wouldn't eat unless someone was nearby. It asked for nothing, but it never left Jennifer's side. When she sat on the porch with a cup of cold coffee, eyes staring blankly at the horizon, Storm lay at her feet. When she wandered through the forest, it followed quietly, not barking, not leading, just close enough to reach if needed. And at night, when the familiar nightmares crashed in like waves, Storm never waited for a call. She had never trained it to sense panic attacks, but it knew. When Jennifer bolted upright in the middle of the night, heart racing, back soaked in cold sweat, Storm was already there, its head resting lightly on her knee, its body pressed gently against her hip, its eyes anchoring her shattering mind back to the present. Not a look of pity or urgency, just certainty. As if to say, "I'm still here. You're not alone." That feeling made her cry, not loudly, but tears still fell. Not for the dream, but for the unexpected tenderness from a nameless, unwanted dog that understood her more than any person ever had. One night, the wind rose from the forest edge, leaves slapped against the cabin walls, and a distant hum from the old radio pulled Jennifer back to the frantic noise of helicopters landing in war zones. She collapsed in the kitchen, arms instinctively shielding her head, as if bracing for artillery. Storm didn't bark, didn't growl. It simply walked over, one careful step at a time, and knelt beside her. It didn't touch her right away, just lay there, patient, like a dock waiting for a ship lost at sea. Only when her body began to tremble did it lean gently into her, applying just enough weight to remind her. She was still here, still alive, and nothing was exploding around her. The next morning, as sunlight streamed through the window, Jennifer watched it curled up at the foot of her bed. She realized Storm had never asked to stay, but she had never wanted it to leave. Between two beings who had survived their storms, one human, one dog, there was no need for promises or conditions. Just a glance was enough to understand. Just presence was enough to heal. And Storm somehow had understood her from day one, not because it had been trained, but because it had lived through the kind of pain she still tried to bury. And perhaps that's why it never left. The first days of winter crept through the Texas forest, carrying with it a chill that slipped between every leaf, every crack in the old wooden cabin that Jennifer now called a refuge. Not a home in the traditional sense, just a place sealed well enough to keep the wind from blowing straight into her bed, and far enough away that no one would find her unless she wanted to be found. But that first winter, the place had something it never had before, a second breath beside her, a being that didn't speak, didn't ask, didn't judge. Storm. They never really chose each other. There was no leash, no formal decision, no calling of names, and eager responses like in typical human-dog bonds. But between them was something else, a recognition. Both carried scars, not just on their bodies, but deep within, echoes of things lost. Storm had no collar, no name tag, no sign of a place he once belonged. Jennifer had no place left to return to. Storm, untrained as he was, had a strange gift Jennifer couldn't deny. On the nights when her sleep was shredded by fragments of battlefield memories, explosions, screams, and the helplessness of bleeding wounds that wouldn't heal, Storm didn't bark, didn't panic. Instead of disrupting the silence, he moved gently toward her, his amber eyes glowing faintly in the dying firelight, then leaned into her, just enough for her to feel the weight of a living presence. Not a memory, but here, now. That feeling, seemingly small, was what saved Jennifer on the coldest nights. When her heart clenched in panic for no apparent reason, Storm didn't need to be called, didn't need commands. He just knew, as if his soul were wired to read her heartbeat. He picked up on every subtle shift, the muscle twitch, the caught breath, the hand clutching the blanket like it was the last thing tethering her to reality. And in those moments, Storm wasn't just a dog, he was an anchor in the storm. One night, the temperature dropped so low, their breath turned to wisps of fog. Despite the effort to keep warm, the cabin shivered with the cold that seeped through the wood. Jennifer curled up, her old military jacket draped over her, but it wasn't enough to drive away the icy feeling that came from within. She didn't cry. Tears froze quickly in winter nights, but her eyes were dry, not from strength, but from being used to sorrow left unwiped. And then, Storm crawled under the blanket, pressed his back against her, and breathed gently against her neck. Something in her, something long presumed dead, softened. She didn't need much, just that warmth. The warmth that didn't demand, didn't impose, didn't interrupt the silence she needed to survive the night. Storm didn't try to fix her. He simply stayed, guarded her, accepted her, even when she couldn't accept herself. In the dim light of winter mornings, when breath still hung silver in the air, she would watch Storm curled up beside her, his fur damp from the snow outside, yet his eyes remained open, watching her as if to say, "You're still here. I'm still here. We're okay." Jennifer began learning how to trust again. Not the world was too chaotic for trust, but a single presence within it. First, small things, letting Storm sleep in her room, then feeding him from her own plate, then the casual strokes along his neck as she passed by. Slowly, the silences between them became sanctuary. No words needed, no explanations. Just presence. Once, during a thunderstorm, a crack of thunder jolted Jennifer into panic. Her body reacted as if still in Kandahar, under artillery fire. She rolled off the bed, heart racing. As always, Storm appeared beside her. But this time, he didn't just watch. He climbed onto her, laying his full weight across her chest. Not enough to harm, but just enough to restrict her breath. She understood. He was applying deep pressure therapy, a physical grounding method for panic attacks. No one had taught him that. He just knew. That winter, through howling winds and sunless days, what kept her going wasn't willpower or even hope. It was Storm's quiet but unyielding presence. A stray once driven by survival instinct, now standing between her and the tidal wave of memory. And in turn, Jennifer became the first safe place Storm had ever known. A home with fire, clean water, and a human who didn't turn him away. They needed no vows, no naming ceremony, no solemn rituals. But by the end of that winter, she called him something. Storm. Not because he appeared in the storm, but because he was the storm. Fierce, uncontainable, but also the force that revived the barren land of her soul. And like a storm, he hadn't come to destroy, but to sweep away the rot and reveal the earth beneath, ready to grow again. As winter began to wane, warmth seeped into every corner of the lonely cabin, not just from the fire, but from the quiet rhythm of life that Storm carried each day. In the soft morning light of March, Jennifer sat on the front steps, hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee, watching the dog as he quietly pawed through fallen leaves around the old oak, where squirrels often darted by. He wasn't hunting. just watching. Storm's focused stillness, occasionally tinged with childlike curiosity, always soothed her. That morning, a familiar pickup truck pulled up at the forest's edge. A man stepped out, wearing a dark khaki coat, his salt-brown hair tousled by the morning breeze. Cole. He was the son of one of Jennifer's old friends, now a veterinarian, and occasionally dropped by when word got out that she needed help. Today, he came to check on Storm's health, after Lily, Jennifer's niece, sent a short message noting Storm's recent light appetite. Storm usually disliked strangers, but this time, as Cole knelt and slowly placed a hand on his back, Storm simply looked up and sat down, allowing the vet to run his fingers down his spine and check joints, heart rate, and eye reflexes. When Cole parted the fur on Storm's chest to examine his lungs, his fingers paused. There, amidst the thick coat, was a patch of lighter fur. Curved, clean, unmistakable, like a crescent moon etched into his skin. "Did you ever notice this mark?" Cole asked, his voice a mix of curiosity and surprise. Jennifer leaned over. She had stroked that chest hundreds of times on cold nights, but never paid attention to the shape of the fur. Under full light, the crescent stood out. A strange insignia, neither scar nor natural fur pattern. "No," she admitted. "Just thought it was a color variation." Cole grew quiet, then suddenly took out his phone. He snapped a close-up and sent a brief message along with it. Jennifer watched him, a strange feeling rising, as if the mark wasn't just about fur. "Who'd you send that to?" she asked, tilting her head. "My dad," Cole replied, eyes still on the screen. "Jeremiah. He helped start one of the South's best service dog breeding programs. Celestial Shepherds. There was one dog in that line with the same mark. That name, Celestial Shepherds, rang like a distant bell. Jennifer didn't know much about dog breeding, but she'd heard it somewhere, maybe at a military medical seminar, or in articles about dogs bred specifically for veterans and PTSD sufferers. Dogs are chosen not just for strength or looks, but for empathy, as if they were born knowing how to read human pain. Storm looked up at her, head tilted, as if sensing the shift in the air. The crescent mark lay quiet on his chest, like a relic neither time nor memory could erase. Soon, Cole's phone lit up. A message. Then the typing dots. Then a photo. A proud German shepherd, eyes bright, posture regal, and on its chest the same crescent mark. Below the image, a handwritten caption. Celestia, 2016. F0 Generation, Celestial Shepherds Program. Jeremiah called immediately. "Where did you find that dog?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. Cole gave a brief account about Jennifer, Storm, and the photo he'd just taken. Silence on the line. "If that mark's real, and those eyes are real, then she's living with a miracle that went missing 5 years ago," Jeremiah said slowly. "Celestia was pregnant when she disappeared in a transport accident. She carried the highest empathic gene in the program, a dog that could sense sorrow like a human. When the van crashed, we only found burnt steel frames and a false report saying all had perished. But I never really believed she died. I think now I know why." Cole ended the call and looked at Jennifer, his jaw tight with words not yet spoken, but she already knew, from the tension in his face, from the way Storm now lay beside her, head lifted, as if ready for something larger than himself. Though she didn't yet fully grasp the meaning of the celestial bloodline, or why the crescent mattered, Jennifer understood one thing. Storm wasn't just a stray who stumbled into her life. He had been born to find someone like her, and maybe she had been kept alive long enough just to find him. Beneath the warm fur, beneath the hardened instinct and fierce resilience, Storm carried a story yet untold, and today, a part of that story had just awakened. The message from Jeremiah arrived on a windless evening, as Jennifer was folding Storm's blanket in the old kitchen she had long since come to see as a sanctuary of peace. The message was brief, but heavy with implications. I want you and Storm to attend the statewide service pet exhibition next month. Let people see what I believe, that the celestial bloodline is still alive and still healing. Jennifer read it several times. She knew of the exhibition. It was the biggest event of the year for service and rescue dogs, a stage for elite training teams, and a magnet for media attention. A place where her presence, a former soldier who had long withdrawn from public life, felt like it wouldn't belong. She set the phone down and turned to Storm. He was lying on the old rug, head resting on his front paws, amber eyes fixed on her as if he understood. There were times Jennifer wondered if he really could read her thoughts. On the nights she cried quietly in the dark, Storm never slept. He'd simply approach softly, lie close beside her, ears alert. On the afternoons when she was too drained to stand, Storm never nudged or whined. He'd just place his head gently on her thigh, heavy enough to remind her she still had a reason to go on. Now that same gaze returned, an expression that seemed to say, "Keep going. Not for medals, not for recognition, but for what we've learned together." Jennifer didn't reply to the message immediately. She needed time, but her mind had already begun to conjure the scene. The exhibition hall, the crowd, stage lights, applause, sharp-eyed judges, and the lingering gaze of old enemies. Inside her chest, an old fear stirred, sharp as an unhealed wound. The next evening, Jeremiah came in person. He arrived looking plain, old wool coat, a gray fabric cap, and eyes that had weathered too much loss. But when he saw Storm, he paused, frozen as if meeting a long-lost fragment of his soul. Storm stepped out of the cabin, not growling, not barking, just walked calmly forward, tilted his head, and sat before Jeremiah in silent respect. "That's the same gaze," Jeremiah said hoarsely. "I saw it in Celestia. A different kind of awareness. Not instinct. Sentience." Under the oil lamp's warm light, they sat around the wooden table. Jennifer told him everything. The night Storm appeared, the way he guarded her sleep, the behaviors that had never been taught. Jeremiah took notes quietly, nodding at intervals. "He doesn't need training," he said finally, "because he chooses his actions. That's the defining trait of a celestial, the ability to sense and respond to human emotion beyond patterns. He doesn't wait for commands. He acts on empathy, and that's exactly what the world needs to see." "Does the world care?" Jennifer asked softly. "Do people still care about empathy when all they see are medals and records?" Jeremiah looked at her, and his aged eyes glowed. "They'll care if you show them, not to prove Storm's worth, but to pass on hope. There are hundreds, thousands of veterans out there who need to be reminded that not everything they lost in war is gone forever. And Storm, he's living proof that something thought lost can return, stronger and more real." Jennifer sat in silence. The reasons she had once used as walls now began to feel like bridges. She had lost faith, not just in the world or others, but in herself. But Storm had come and rebuilt her soul, brick by brick, with the steady presence that never asked for anything. Joining the exhibition meant stepping into the light, and it would not be easy. But in Storm's eyes, she saw a clear message. We're not hiding anymore. That night she didn't sleep. Storm lay beside her as always, but this time when she rested her hand on his back, it wasn't seeking support. It was the silent agreement of a new commitment. She would enter the crowd. She would tell Storm's story, not as a triumph, but as a quiet miracle. The next morning, she replied to Jeremiah with 3 words: "We're going." They arrived just as the last wisps of dawn faded from the gray horizon. Jennifer slipped on her coat and opened the truck door for Storm. The exhibition parking lot sat tucked behind a grove of old oaks, and from a distance, rows of tents already shimmered in soft yellow floodlights. She stood still for a moment, hand resting on Storm's shoulder, inhaling deeply as though bracing for a new kind of battlefield. Not with weapons, but with memories, bias, and the scrutiny of eyes that would weigh every step they took. Storm didn't bark. He didn't bolt forward like the other excited dogs tugging their handlers toward the staging area. He walked steadily, calmly beside Jennifer, his gaze sweeping the grounds with instinctive caution, like surveying the terrain before letting down his guard. Passers-by began to glance their way, not because Storm was bigger or more striking, but because his calm presence seemed to slow the world around him. Soon, the stares became more pointed. Some whispered and gestured, others approached to ask questions, but their eyes always lingered too long on Storm's chest, where the crescent-shaped fur stood out beneath the sleek black coat. A middle-aged trainer in a branded windbreaker crouched to observe, speaking in a tone part admiration, part suspicion. "Never seen a marking like that on any shepherd line lately. It's unusual." Jennifer said nothing, subtly shifting to shield Storm. An instinctive, protective gesture that seemed casual but wasn't. At registration, when she filled in the forms and handed over her ID, a staff member scanned the entry. Jennifer Whitaker and Storm. Category: Service Dog Demonstration. He frowned slightly, then looked up. First at Jennifer, then at Storm, sitting perfectly by her side, his posture so textbook it could have been pulled from a manual. "You competed before?" the man asked. "No," Jennifer answered simply. "Storm's not a show dog. He's a companion." The man nodded slightly, but his eyes, like so many others that morning, held something wary, occasionally doubtful. Some smiled and wished her luck, but most gave her the glances of people trying to decide. Not if Storm was good enough, but if he belonged here at all. And then the silence of the grounds broke by another arrival. A gleaming SUV slid into the VIP lot. Its door opened, and out stepped the man Jeremiah had warned her about, Chuck Redford. His face bore none of the time-worn edges like Jennifer's or Jeremiah's. Instead, it gleamed with polished success. Skin smooth, not young, just untouched. Cold. He walked like a man used to paths clearing for him, his eyes scanning the grounds like a predator choosing prey. He stopped when he saw Storm. Jennifer felt that gaze like a cold wire running up her spine. Storm felt it too. He stood and turned his back to her, positioning himself squarely between her and Redford. No growl, no snarl, but his body went taut, drawn tight like a bowstring. Redford approached his gaze directly. "Beautiful," he said, his voice soft as velvet, thin as a blade. "Whose dog?" "Mine," Jennifer replied, eyes steady on his. "Got papers?" Jennifer said nothing. One breathless second stretched long. Redford smirked slightly. "I have a feeling we'll be seeing more of each other." Then he turned and walked away, but left behind a weight in the air like night clinging to fabric. Jennifer looked at Storm. He was still there, still watching until Redford vanished behind the rows of tents. Ears alert, their shoulders are tense, ready to move if she so much as shifted a hand. "He knows something," she whispered. Storm turned to look at her, amber eyes catching the midday light. Still, but never empty. That afternoon, a few other trainers stopped by their small corner of the grounds. One asked to take a closer look at Storm's coat and bone structure, calling it an uncommon type. Another inquired about his lineage, asking if Jennifer knew who his parents were. All of them withdrew under the weight of her silence and steady gaze. That evening, when Jeremiah came by and heard the full account, he sat in quiet thought before saying, "If Celestia gave birth during that transport accident, Storm may be one of them. And if that's true, Redford won't let it go." Jennifer looked at Storm, lying beside her as always, head resting on her leg, and knew that if anyone deserved to be protected at all costs, it was him. Not because of the rare crescent mark, not because of some hidden bloodline, but because Storm had pulled her back from the edge once. And now it was her turn to stand firm for him. Under the soft tent light, in the far corner of the exhibition, she whispered, "We're not here to win a prize." Storm flicked his tail, not needing a reason. The last light of the exhibition grounds went out just after midnight. In the dim silence of Tent 29, only the occasional gust of wind fluttering through the canvas and the steady breathing of Storm remained. The dog lying beside Jennifer, though not asleep. Since the afternoon, Storm had been unusually alert. Every passerby, every distant voice made him lift his head, ears pricked, eyes locked on something as if making calculations. As night fell, his unease didn't fade. It merely ran quietly beneath the surface of his calm demeanor. He didn't bark, didn't whimper, but each time the wind shifted, his nose twitched, his gaze sharpened. Jennifer noticed, and unlike most nights, she didn't settle in. She sat with her back against the tent wall, keeping Storm close. They stayed like that until Storm suddenly left his spot. Soundless. He moved to the back flap of the tent, where the canvas had been loosely tied for ventilation. Jennifer leaned in, hand already on the small but powerful flashlight hidden in her bag. Storm froze for a moment, then slowly turned his head to her. No bark, no sudden motion, just a deep, locked gaze, carrying unspoken urgency. And Jennifer understood. It was a warning that needed no words. She turned off all the lights inside the tent, and then followed Storm. They moved like shadows. Outside, the exhibition grounds were empty. No security guards in sight. They slipped behind the tents, past stalls that had already been locked for the night as handlers retreated to nearby hotels. Only Jennifer's tent still had a faint glow. She never let Storm sleep in complete darkness. Then Storm stopped. Body crouched low, neck stretched forward, every muscle coiled tight. Jennifer followed his gaze and saw them. Two men, hunched near the rear flap of the tent. One pulled out something. It caught the faint light like metal. She held her breath. A syringe. Jennifer's chest tightened, the reflex of a soldier's instincts long sharpened. This wasn't random theft or idle curiosity. This was targeted, deliberate, dangerous. Storm didn't move, but lowered his head further, his focus shifting from warning to readiness. Jennifer's hand brushed his neck, not to restrain, but to signal. A gesture they both knew. Stay. Watch. Wait for the right moment. She pulled out her phone, but the screen was black. The battery had shown 60% earlier. Now it was dead. She gritted her teeth. Someone had tampered with the shared charging station near the campgrounds. All she had left was Storm. Go, she whispered. Storm darted into the darkness, but not toward the intruders. He looped around toward the front where the guards were stationed, stopped in front of them, gave a low growl, then ran a few paces toward the tent, turning back as if beckoning them. The two young guards straightened up, startled. Storm gave another low growl, eyes blazing. One of the guards understood and ran after him. At the same time, Jennifer moved in quickly. "Stop right there!" she barked, her voice crisp, commanding. The men were startled. The one holding the syringe dropped it. Before either could retreat, the guard's flashlight swept over their faces. One guard reached for cuffs, and the other called for backup. Within moments, both intruders were detained. "We were just checking on our dog," one stammered. "Your stall is in Sector D. This is Sector B," the guard said coldly. "And you have no ID badges?" Storm returned to Jennifer's side, positioning himself between her and the men. He didn't growl, didn't threaten, but his body formed an invisible wall that no one dared cross. Inside one man's pocket, the guards found a small vial of cloudy liquid, a note on the bottle, labeled in Latin. Cole arrived shortly after. He sniffed the contents, and his face changed. "Strong sedative," he said quietly. "Just a few food drops would knock a large dog out for 12 hours. "And injected?" Jennifer asked, eyes still on the cuffed men. "This would cause neurological disruption, heart arrhythmia. It's playing roulette with the dog's life," Cole answered, voice low, eyes dark with worry. Jennifer said nothing. She simply reached back and placed her hand gently on Storm's head. He looked up at her, the tension fading from his eyes, as if he understood. The threat had passed. The danger, at least for now, was over. That night, security around the tents was reinforced. But Jennifer didn't sleep. She spread a blanket near the tent's entrance. Storm lay beside her, not sleeping much either, resting his head on her legs every so often, as if to reassure her, no matter what the world tried to do. She wasn't alone. No one taught him to do that. Storm just knew, because he had stood with her on the edge before. And now he stood watch again, guarding the thin line between safety and pain, not with fangs, but with the unwavering presence of loyalty. In the pale light of the fading event lamps, the aftermath of the midnight intrusion still echoed silently through the air like a taut wire, waiting to snap. Despite increased patrols by security, their presence did little to calm Jennifer's pulse. A soldier's body remembers the feel of nights like these, the kind where silence wasn't peace, but the warning before everything exploded. She couldn't sleep. Every noise that cracked through the stillness, every footstep that faded and returned, pulled her back to places she thought she'd left behind. Storm lay beside her, not asleep either. He shifted occasionally, then pressed his solid frame tighter against her leg, as if to say, "You're not alone. No leash, no commands, just a quiet sentinel, gaze fixed on the entrance, ears alert to every beat. On that long night, they weren't handlers and dogs. They were comrades, two survivors who knew how to wait in silence for storms to pass. When dawn finally brushed through the high glass panels of the exhibition hall, a familiar rhythm of footsteps approached. The storm rose slightly. Lily, Jennifer's niece, rushed in, visibly alarmed. "Grandma, Cole told me. What happened last night?" she blurted. Then she froze. Her eyes landed on Jennifer's face. Not tired, not shaken, just calm, wide awake, alert in a way Lily had never seen. She looked like someone who had just returned from a mission where she was the only one who made it back. Then Lily's gaze shifted to Storm, the nameless dog from years ago, now sitting like a stone statue, alert and composed. His eyes held something that anchored the whole room, an invisible thread pulling everything into stillness. Nothing collapsed, nothing fell apart, because Storm was still holding it all together, just by being there. Jennifer sat up straighter and picked up the cold coffee Cole had left at first light. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice remained calm. "We're okay. It was a long night, but Storm held the line, just like he always does." Storm glanced at Jennifer, then rested his head on her thigh, as if affirming every word. Lily stepped closer, gently placing a hand on Storm's back. "I saw in a video once. They said only special dogs stay calm in danger, like they know what to do without being taught." Jennifer nodded, her eyes never leaving Storm. "No one taught him, but he knows, and that's what saved me. Last night, and so many other nights." For a moment, morning itself seemed to hold its breath, as if acknowledging a rare truth shared between them. That survival wasn't just about staying alive. It was about having someone who understood you deeply enough not to leave, even in your darkest hours. Storm lifted his head, glanced at both women, then turned back toward the tent door, where soft golden light filtered in and cast a gentle glow on his thick fur, now shimmering with a quiet amber hue. He was still on duty, not for medals, not for applause, but for the one person who had needed him exactly when the world had threatened to swallow her whole. And now the world would know Storm, not as a contestant in an exhibition, but as a soul standing guard on the edge of someone's life, a living symbol of loyalty, of instinct no training could ever teach. The weariness of a sleepless night lingered in Jennifer's eyes as she stood before the small mirror hanging temporarily in the stall. The crow's feet around her eyes seemed deeper, and the silver hair tied at the back of her neck couldn't hide the fresh dark circles under her eyes. But when she lowered her gaze and met Storm's, his golden brown eyes glinting in the morning light, all the fatigue melted away, replaced by something almost sacred. Clarity, and an unshakable purpose. Storm sat quietly by the familiar rug, his posture firm, tail wrapped tightly around his feet, his head slightly raised, watching Jennifer's every movement as though each breath she took was the only map he needed for the challenge ahead. Cole stepped in, carrying 2 cups of hot coffee and a small paper bag with freshly baked bread. He placed them on the makeshift wooden table, then leaned against the wall, his gaze never leaving the pair that had shaken the arena since last night. "Only an hour left," he said quietly. "The judges are taking their seats. Jeremiah is holding a spot for us on the judging panel. The kids from other sections are gathering by the stands. Looks like it'll be crowded today." Jennifer took the coffee. "Thank you," she replied briefly. Inside, there was no worry. Only a deep calm, like when she used to step onto a battlefield, fully aware that all strategies now were mere frameworks. What mattered most was reflex, instinct, and the person by her side she could trust to the end. Cole didn't speak again, just looked at Storm, then spoke slowly. "Jennifer, you know they're not looking for perfect performances, right? They've seen enough. Those well-rehearsed routines, commands executed to the second. But what stands out the most, what truly makes people stop, is connection." He paused, his gaze meeting Storm's attentive eyes. Storm is a living example of that. He doesn't follow orders, he senses. And people will see that. Jennifer nodded slightly. No need for many words. She knew exactly what Cole meant, but hearing it from someone outside, someone who understood both the human and animal worlds as he did, still felt like the confirmation she needed. Storm stood up and approached, gently resting his head on her knee as if agreeing. Jennifer reached out and stroked his soft coat, her fingers running along his spine, feeling each subtle shift beneath his fur. That feeling had once been the only thing keeping her grounded during the deepest crises. "We have nothing to prove," Jennifer said after a moment of silence. "Not out of pride, but because we've lived long enough in places where no one could see to understand that true value isn't in performance. It's in presence." Cole smiled. "And today, everyone in that arena will witness that." The sound of the PA system echoed, announcing that participants in the service dog demonstration should begin heading to the staging area. The voice of the announcer was steady, not rushed, but rhythmic enough to make Jennifer's heart beat faster. She stood up, tightening her grip on Storm's leash. He understood immediately, positioning himself beside her without command. They stepped out of the stall. Eyes started to turn, some quietly, some surprised, even some disdainful glares from well-dressed competitors in expensive training uniforms. But Jennifer didn't look at them. She just walked, each step firm, with Storm by her right side, as though stepping onto a new battlefield. Not to fight, but to tell a story that only she and this dog could share. And at the end of the long hallway, the light from the main stage area shone like an invitation. Not for a performance, but for them to stand as they truly were. In the soft, golden light spilling from the far end of the stage hallway, Jennifer and Storm moved into the waiting area like two shadows pressed close together, the woman still carrying the disciplined air of a former soldier, and the German shepherd beside her walking in step, not because of forced training, but because of a deep harmony that made each breath resonate together. When their names were called by the announcer, representing Stall 29, Jennifer Whitaker and Storm, a wave of murmurs rippled across the stands. Some unfamiliar faces, some curious, and many who had been there the night before waited in quiet anticipation. Camera lenses zoomed in on them. Flashing lights flickered in the crowd, but both moved with a calmness that couldn't be mimicked. No matching uniforms, no flashy leash. Storm wore only the old leather collar that had once belonged to Jennifer's father, a piece of memory she had kept like a talisman, now being passed on to the creature who had pulled her from the deepest dark. When they stood in the center of the arena, under the soft white light falling directly from the spotlight, Jennifer could feel her heartbeat beginning to shift. Cold sweat beaded down her back. Part of it was the tension of being in front of the crowd, but much of it came from the silent memories passing through her mind like an old newscast. The sound of helicopters, the smell of gunpowder, and the times her hands had trembled as she pulled a white cloth over a familiar face. Storm sensed it before Jennifer did. He shifted slightly, without a word being spoken, then moved closer to her leg, just enough for his body to touch her calf. A reminder. I'm here. Look at me. Jennifer didn't need a script. She didn't read the introduction like the others before her. Instead, her voice rang out steadily, loud enough to fill the whole room without shouting. Storm wasn't trained in any center. He didn't learn these reactions from a textbook. Everything you're about to see is instinct. Empathy born from the pain we've shared. She began to walk slowly around the arena, Storm moving in perfect sync beside her. But less than halfway through the circle, she stopped abruptly. Her breath hitched, her gaze no longer on the crowd, but locked on some distant point in the empty space. The sounds around her blurred, replaced by the crack of gunfire, screams for help, and the familiar clink of metal against metal in her memory. It was the simulation she'd practiced. But like every time, the tightness in her chest was real. Her heart was truly erratic. Jennifer's fear wasn't that she was reliving the panic in front of an audience, but that she wouldn't escape it in time. And Storm, without even looking up, knew. He stepped forward, pressing his body against her knees, his amber eyes locking onto hers, releasing a steady breath. No bark, no lick, no unnecessary movement. Just a quiet, unwavering presence, his rhythm as steady as a clock's hands in a world spinning out of control. Jennifer's hand swept down, resting on his head as a survival instinct. Her trembling hand slowly steadied, merging with the warmth under his thick coat. When she sank onto the wooden bench prepared beside the stage, Storm automatically climbed halfway onto her lap, the weight of his body applying just enough pressure to trigger a healing response, a technique called deep pressure therapy. But for them, it was an instinct no one had taught. The entire arena fell silent. No sound, no whispers. Everyone was watching the moment unfold. A woman struggling with an unhidden panic, and a dog doing nothing but fully existing within her emotional whirlwind. No commands, no training cues, just connection. When Jennifer regained her breath, she smiled softly and nodded toward Storm, as one would nod to thank a comrade who had carried them across the battlefield. Storm stepped back, sitting at her feet as if completing a sacred mission. Then, like a wave rippling from the furthest seats, the first applause began. Then a second, and soon the entire arena erupted in resounding applause, not for a performance of skills, but for a lesson in trust, companionship, and the saving instinct between two souls once cast aside. Amid the thunderous applause, Storm simply sat quietly beside Jennifer, his head slightly tilted toward her, as if she was the only world he cared about. As the final applause gradually subsided, the arena returned to its normal rhythm, but the atmosphere in the hall still hung suspended by the echoes of what had just occurred. Some spectators wiped away tears. Those who had remained silent now whispered, calling one another to look at the German shepherd, who still sat motionless at the feet of the woman, its posture calm, almost eerily so, as though nothing extraordinary had happened, as though the role of a dog was simply to save a life and then return quietly to its silent duty. At the judges' table, Thomas Granger, the man with neatly combed silver hair, a face weathered with experience and eyes that had seen thousands of performances, still stood, his arms crossed, eyes never leaving Storm. When Jennifer and Storm left the stage, he didn't sit back down. He turned to the organizers, murmured a few words, and then, as if driven by something deeper than professional admiration, quietly left the table and made his way across the backstage area, where stall 29 was receiving congratulations and handshakes from passing people. He found Jennifer sitting, removing the leash from Storm's collar. Despite having just completed an emotionally charged performance, her expression remained alert, her gaze cautious, and Storm, still by her side, lay with his head resting close to her foot, as though waiting for the slightest movement from her to spring into action. Granger stopped a few steps away from them, his voice low but clear. "Ms. Whitaker." Jennifer looked up, nodding with a slight but disciplined gesture. "Sir." He took a few more steps forward, his gaze again lingering on Storm. "What is the history of this dog?" I noticed a peculiar marking on his chest, a light crescent shape under the dark fur. That's not a common feature. Jennifer followed his gaze, then gently ran her fingers over Storm's soft coat, where the lighter fur formed a curved shape, like a waxing moon. "I'm not sure about his background. I found Storm during a heavy rainstorm at Timber Ravine 5 years ago. He didn't have a collar, no microchip, and no one was looking for him." Granger nodded slowly. "Sounds similar to what I've heard." He then turned to Jeremiah, who had appeared quietly from behind, both old men exchanging a knowing glance. "Do you still remember Celestia?" Jeremiah asked, his voice thick. Granger didn't answer immediately. He knelt, extending his hand slowly, giving Storm time to evaluate before gently bringing his palm near the dog's nose. Storm sniffed briefly, then stepped back a half step, still silent, eyes fixed on the stranger, cautious but not hostile. "That's the reflex," Granger murmured, almost to himself. "He acts with instinctive caution, strangely composed, yet never fearful or retreating. And the way he uses his body weight to calm, this is a spontaneous skill, not something you find in typical training manuals." Jeremiah stepped closer, pulling out his phone and scrolling through old photos. "Celestia, 5 years ago. She was pregnant at the time. Went missing in a transport accident managed by Redford." Granger took the phone, studying the picture carefully. He didn't speak right away, but when he handed the phone back, his gaze turned to Storm once more, and he spoke firmly. "I've followed the Celestial program from the beginning. It was one of the most courageous and misunderstood experiments in the training world. Instead of choosing dogs based on physical traits or productivity, Jeremiah chose for their ability to empathize. We were heavily criticized," Jeremiah said quietly. "People called it romanticism, unrealistic. They said dogs needed to follow commands, not emotions. But Celestia proved that deep emotion could create reflexes far beyond commands." Granger nodded. "And if I'm not mistaken, Storm shows all the signs of that line. Not just the coat, the build, but the behavior as well. The way he watches Jennifer's eyes. The way he reads her neurological state without any guidance." Jennifer sat still, listening in silence as if hearing a story about her own companion's soul, but in a language she had never learned. "You know," Granger continued thoughtfully, "if Storm is truly Celestia's descendant, then his presence here today is not just a performance. It's a testimony that the Celestial program didn't die, that something sacred survived, even when everyone thought it was gone." Storm, now lying down, his head resting on Jennifer's foot, eyes half closed but ears still alert, didn't understand the words, but he felt the significance of Celestia's name and the emotions in the voice speaking it. He knew, and Jennifer, for the first time, placed her hand gently on Storm's chest, where the crescent-shaped mark lay hidden beneath the fur, quietly acknowledging a legacy that needed no paperwork. "Could it be," she whispered, "that he is what's left of a forgotten dream?" Jeremiah placed his hand on her shoulder, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "It's no longer a dream, Jennifer. From today, it's come into the light." Granger had barely left the stall when his words about the Celestial legacy still lingered in the air like a foreboding, and Chuck Redford appeared, as if waiting for that very moment. His gaze was cold and sharp, barely concealed greed lurking behind his forced, polite smile. Beside him were 2 men in dark suits, exuding more of a lawyer's presence than exhibition visitors. "That dog," Redford said in an even tone but barely restrained anger, "is property of Redford Breeding Enterprises, and you, Ms. Whitaker, are unlawfully holding my property." Jennifer stood tall, the instinct of her military training keeping her composed, but she could feel her hand tightening around Storm's leash, a reflex of defense. Storm raised his head, his dark amber eyes burning through Redford. No growl, no threat, but the way he positioned himself between Jennifer and the newcomers made the entire stall feel suddenly cramped, suffocating. Storm doesn't belong to anyone, Jennifer said softly, her voice carrying the armor of someone who had faced death. I didn't steal him. I saved him. Redford shrugged his face, one of someone too used to dismissing emotional claims. He pulled a stack of papers from the briefcase of the man standing behind him, placing them squarely on the display table. This is the registration for the Celestial Shepherd line, with Celestia's litter code. The dog that went missing in a transport accident 5 years ago. Here's the copy of the claim I'm about to file with the court. And this, he pointed to a faded color photograph, is Celestia, with the signature crescent on her chest. How coincidental do you think it is that your dog has the same mark? Storm didn't understand the accusations, but he sensed Jennifer's tension, her breath slowing, her eyes darkening. He moved closer, gently leaning his head against her hand, a pressure just enough to ground her, bringing her back to the present, to right here, with him. Jennifer tightened her grip on the leash, not out of fear, but to remind herself of the silent thread that had saved her for 5 years. I don't care about bloodlines, she said, her voice calm but with strength. I care about the only thing that's real. Storm has been here, night after night, when I wasn't even myself. He's not property. He's a part of me. Redford said nothing more, but his eyes slid over Storm, as if measuring the value of a lost artifact. Before he left, he threw one last remark like a knife onto the table. The court will decide. And you won't be able to fight me, Whitaker. Not with your past, not with a stray dog with no papers. As Redford's shadow receded through the aisles between the booths, the space seemed to breathe again, released from an invisible storm. Cole and Lily approached, their faces filled with concern. Jeremiah sat quietly at the table, his eyes fixed on the papers Redford had left behind. He didn't speak, but his hand, placed on his knee, trembled, not from age, but from memory. That night, Jennifer's phone received multiple calls from unknown numbers. Anonymous texts flooded in, hinting that if she withdrew from the competition, everything would smooth over. Strange people began loitering near their area, acting like they were just passing by. Storm sensed the disturbance. He got up again and again, checking every noise, every unfamiliar scent in the air. No words, just actions, like a silent sentry. And Jennifer understood. The days ahead wouldn't just be about the competition. They would be a new battle. Another line to defend is where the enemies didn't carry guns but laws and power. But this time, she wasn't alone. Storm had entered her life like a quiet ghost, and stayed as the reason to live. That night it didn't rain, but the air was thick, as though it were waiting for an impending storm. After the anonymous calls and the shadowy power of Redford loomed over the exhibition space, Jennifer couldn't sleep. Storm lay beside her, as still as a rock, his head resting on her leg, eyes fixed on the entrance to the booth. On nights like these, the only sounds were the steady breathing of a loyal dog and the heartbeat of the survivor, confirming that they were still present in the world. The booth door gently rattled. It wasn't the wind. Storm jumped up silently, not barking, but his whole body was tense. Jennifer had sat up long ago, her hand instinctively resting on the leash. A figure of a man appeared under the emergency light. Not an intruder sneaking in, but Travis Redford, the only son of Chuck Redford. "Don't call security," he whispered, his hand raised to show he wasn't carrying anything dangerous. "I'm not here to harm. I'm here to warn." Storm didn't move, but his gaze was locked on the stranger, as if deciding whether or not memory allowed for forgiveness. "What are you doing here?" Jennifer asked, her voice quiet but sharp, like a blade in the night. Travis swallowed, then met her eyes. "There was a flash flood in Timber Ravine that year. I was stuck on a rock outcrop and the water rose so fast I thought I was going to die. No signal. No one knew where I was. And then Storm showed up. No collar, no leash, just there, looking at me, as if he had chosen to come." He paused, as if touching a memory that made him feel strange to himself. "He pulled me out of the water and stayed next to me all night. Didn't leave, didn't fear, just stayed there. guarding. Jennifer still didn't take her eyes off him, but her expression started to change. It was no longer just suspicion, but listening. "I never told my father," Travis continued. "I knew he'd see him as proof, as a trophy from Celestia. He never gave up on finding her descendants. The crash with Celestia's car wasn't staged, but when Celestia disappeared into the woods, he made the incident a secret. He fabricated that everyone died, then quietly sent people to search Timber Ravine for years." Storm, as if understanding that this conversation was a matter of life and death, moved closer to Travis. He didn't growl, just stood still beside him like a living shadow, observing every heartbeat and breath. "He has a plan for tomorrow," Travis said quickly, as if fearing his courage would fade. "After the last test, he'll call animal control with all the papers and verified evidence. They'll seize Storm as property of Redford Breeding." Jennifer felt her stomach tighten, not because of surprise, but because of the feeling that she wouldn't be able to protect what she loved. Once again, Storm seemed to sense her distress. He moved closer to her, resting lightly against her calf, a familiar gesture whenever she started to falter emotionally. His presence was the answer, though no one had asked. "You have to leave here. Tonight," Travis said firmly, his tone softening. "I know you've come this far to compete, to prove yourself, but if Storm is taken, there won't be a second chance. To him, he's just a valuable gene. Nothing more." Jennifer looked at Storm. He still stood there, calm and loyal, as if ready to go wherever she chose. But in those dark brown eyes, there was something that made Jennifer feel she was being awakened from a daze, a trust and a willingness to protect, even if she was the one who needed to be protected. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked Travis, her suspicion still evident. Travis sighed, his hand unconsciously resting on the spot where Storm had once leaned against him in the rain. "Because once he saved my life, and I've stayed silent all these years. I can't stay silent anymore." Storm moved closer, nudging his nose against Travis's hand, a gesture just enough to bring tears to the young man's eyes. He hadn't forgotten, and he had never judged. After Travis left, only the breath of the night and the light wind brushing against the tarp remained in the booth. Jennifer sat down, her back against the rough wooden wall, her hand on Storm's back. He curled beside her as if everything that had just happened was inevitable. No noise, no panic, just another night, waiting for dawn again. But this time, with a heart heavy with the choice, retreat quietly, or confront to keep what no one could price. "You saved him, then saved me," Jennifer whispered, her voice nearly choking. "Now it's my turn to save you." Storm didn't reply, but when she placed her hand on his head, he pressed his cheek against her palm, the warmth speaking volumes. "Wherever you go, as long as I go with you." When the booth door closed behind Travis' footsteps, the space fell back into silence, but not into peace. It was suffocating, like a bunker just sealed, where every choice felt suffocating. Jennifer stayed seated, her shoulder against the rough wooden wall, her palm resting on the warm fur of Storm. He wasn't asleep, nor had he left. He lay there, alert but silent, like a seasoned night watchman, waiting for a signal from a teammate who had lost their way within their mind. Outside, the sky wasn't quite bright yet. The soft yellow lights from the exhibition hall reflected through the booth's tarp, casting trembling shadows. There was no sound, except for the wind gently rustling through the tarp and the slow, steady breathing of a dog who had never once taken its eyes off the one person it chose to trust. Jennifer tossed and turned, her mind unsettled for hours. She was no longer the seasoned soldier from years ago. At least it didn't feel that way. In this darkness, what she faced wasn't bullets, but the invisible power of authority, paperwork, and laws. Cold and blind things. The people who could take Storm away with just a name on a piece of paper. Storm lay beside her, his chin resting on her thigh, his eyes wide open, not sleeping through the night. Every time she exhaled sharply, he nudged her gently with his shoulder, just as he had done during her nightmares. No one had taught him this. He just knew. He just did it out of love. Jennifer closed her eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, memories surfaced. Nights in Timber Ravine, when she huddled, shivering in the dark, and Storm, who had been just a nameless dog then, had silently approached, never pushing, never threatening, just lying beside her. Then the winter mornings, when his breath warmed the thin blanket they shared, and the first time Storm gently nudged her head when a panic attack gripped her, making her cry in gratitude until she couldn't speak. Now, faced with the choice between justice and safety, between truth and once again running away, she felt weak, weaker than when she first came back from the war. Not because the enemy was too strong, but because she didn't know if she could bear to watch Storm be taken away like property, a valuable item someone else wanted, not because of love, but because of power. Near dawn, the first light gently crept through the tarp's cracks. Storm still hadn't left, not sleeping, not hungry. Only one task remained: to stay with her until she spoke. Jennifer pulled her hand away from his neck and sat up straight, her face as if carved out from the night. The old, tough soldier's features remained, but her gaze had changed. No longer the fiery look of a fighter, but the eyes of someone preparing to retreat. "We'll leave before the exam," she whispered. Her voice was low and hoarse, as though every word was pulled from deep in her chest. Storm just tilted his head, not protesting, but Jennifer saw his gaze soften, not out of fear, but sadness, as if he had known, and had stayed all night just to hear this. When Cole brought breakfast and coffee, he immediately noticed something was wrong. Jennifer didn't look up. Storm stood, moving toward Cole as if to take his place, once again, standing in for her, taking responsibility when she was breaking inside. She told him Travis's words, quietly, without drama, just the facts falling piece by piece, like bullets hitting the ground. Cole was silent as he listened. His face changed with each piece of the story, from surprise to anger, then to helplessness. "So, we lose?" he asked when she finished. Jennifer looked at Storm. The dog still stood there, silent as a statue. But to her, he wasn't just a dog. He was the anchor of her soul for years, the only lifeline she'd ever had. She lowered her gaze. "We haven't lost. We just can't fight the way they want us to." At that moment, Lily walked in. Her young granddaughter, the one who always looked at her with admiration, stopped dead in the doorway, her face pale when she heard the words, "Give up." Tears flowed without a sound. They just rolled down the cheeks of a girl who had just lost faith in victory. "I thought you and Storm would never give up," Lily whispered, so quietly that only Storm could hear, and he turned his head slightly. Jennifer didn't respond right away. She stepped forward and knelt before Storm, placing her hand on his neck, the place where so many times she had held him tight when fear came. "I don't want to give up," she said to Lily, "but if we keep going, we might lose Storm forever." Lily turned away, clenching her fists as if trying to swallow her emotions. After a moment, she spoke softly. "But if no one dares to stand up, nothing will ever change." That simple statement felt like a sharp cut. Jennifer froze, looking back at Storm. The dog looked up, his pupils as deep as the winter lake, reflecting something she couldn't name. Perhaps trust. Perhaps a reminder that no matter what, he wouldn't leave first. And then, between the dim light of the early day and the cold morning mist, Jennifer stood up straight. No longer the person prepared to give up. No longer the steps of someone ready to leave. Just a soldier who had lost so much, but still had one thing left to hold on to. "We're not leaving," she said, her voice now sharp. "But we'll need a plan." Storm moved forward, stopping beside her, his calm and determined gaze like an unspoken affirmation. And in the pale morning light, they didn't choose to retreat. They stood up together. That early morning, booth number 29 was still shrouded in the dim light of a dawn that hadn't fully revealed the outlines of everything around it. This space had long become the silent refuge of wounds. The place where Jennifer had once thought would mark the end of her struggle, the end of her dream to see Storm recognized not as a stray dog, but as a living symbol of love, instinct, and loyalty. After a night of almost no sleep, Jennifer was packing up the few belongings she had, her hands still trembling slightly, though her eyes had returned to a calm that was more of a facade she had learned in her years in the military. Storm lay beside her, never straying an inch. When she folded the thin blanket that had covered both her and Storm throughout the long exhibition nights, a small sound behind her made her freeze. "Are you leaving?" The voice was soft, choked, like a note of music swallowed before it could be sung loudly, yet still strong enough to shatter the frozen silence in Jennifer's heart. Lily stood in the doorway, her old, wrinkled hoodie hanging loosely, her red-rimmed eyes and her hands gripping a hair tie as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. She had come earlier than usual, before the sun even called, perhaps because that young heart of hers had sensed something in the sorrowful silence that Jennifer could no longer conceal. Jennifer didn't respond immediately. Storm raised his head, gently tilting it as he looked at Lily, then at Jennifer. An unspoken bond, a connection that tied these three seemingly disparate lives together. "You have to protect Storm." Jennifer's voice came slowly, as if she was explaining it more to herself than to Lily. "If we stay, we could lose him." Lily stepped forward. Her eyes were full of tears, but not weakness. "I know," she replied. "But if you withdraw, we'll lose him in another way." Storm stepped closer to Lily, then silently sat beside her, his head resting on her knee as if to comfort her. The girl reached up to stroke his upright ears, Storm's eyes half closed in peaceful calm. At that moment, Lily no longer seemed like a child pleading with an adult to change her mind. She was a keeper of the flame, protecting the meaning of what was right, even as the world seemed ready to snuff it out. "Do you remember the first time I saw Storm?" Lily spoke softly. "He stood between me and your anger, not with a bark, but with his eyes. Like he was telling me, she doesn't want to hurt you." Jennifer froze. Memories surged, not in a linear fashion, but like rising waves. The time Storm pushed open the door in the middle of the night to remind her to take her medication, when he sat by Lily's feet for hours during the first therapy session, when he climbed onto the rotting wooden platform just to prevent a veteran having a panic attack from harming himself. None of this had been taught to Storm. He just knew because he had once felt it. "I know I'm just a little girl, and I don't understand the big things," Lily continued, her voice trembling. "But I know Storm doesn't belong to Redford. He belongs to you. He belongs to us. And if you give up today, everything he's done won't matter. People will never know him. They will never believe a dog can save someone, not with teeth or strength, but with love." Jennifer's chest tightened. It was a kind of pain unlike the physical pain that had plagued her for years. It was the pain of awakening. She had learned to fight for survival. But had she ever truly fought for something beautiful, something pure? The Storm was still there, quietly, patiently, without barking, without pushing. All she had to do was look into his eyes, the golden light in them reflecting her image. Gentler, braver. "You once told me," Lily said, her voice no longer filled with tears, "that courage isn't not being afraid, but moving forward even when you're scared to death." Jennifer laughed softly. It was a rare sound in the long chain of lonely days. Then she knelt, level with Lily, and embraced the girl in her trembling arms. "You're right," she whispered. "Storm deserves to be seen, to be heard, to be called by his real name. We won't turn our backs." Lily hugged her tighter. Storm slowly placed his front paws on Jennifer's shoulders, exhaled softly, and from somewhere in the warmth of the three of them, like a vow without words, they stood up, not for the prize, not for pride, but for the truth that needed to be heard, and for the heart that needed to remain where it truly belonged. Before Lily's words had even settled, the familiar footsteps of Jeremiah echoed at the entrance of the booth, heavy, yet decisive. In his hand was an old leather briefcase, its stitches worn and frayed as if carrying the marks of years and secrets never spoken. He didn't speak immediately, only looked Jennifer in the eyes, then placed the briefcase on the folding wooden table beside her bed. The air in the booth seemed to contract, compressed by silence, as his hand quietly unlocked the case. Inside were yellowed papers, edges frayed, but the ink marks were still startlingly clear, as if the past was returning on its own to demand justice. Jeremiah first pulled out a certificate of pedigree with the seal of the International Working Dog Association. The name was printed clearly: Celestia. Below are the chip number, DNA records, and genetic assessments confirming rare traits. Cole stepped closer, breathing softly as if afraid the wind might blow away the past from their hands. "I didn't know you kept these, Dad." Jeremiah nodded, his eyes bloodshot, not from lack of sleep, but because he had buried them for so many years. Not from forgetting, but from pain. "I couldn't throw them away, but I couldn't bear to look at them. Not until I saw Storm yesterday. Not until I knew this girl and that dog were being threatened like I once was." He continued pulling out the next paper, a hand-drawn genetic chart, carefully marking every dominant trait, every genetic cycle, with bold and precise notes. And then, finally, the paper that froze the air in the booth, a shipping contract signed 5 years ago with an official seal and the unmistakable blue ink signature: Chuck Redford. Jennifer took the paper, her hands, once steady as a soldier's, now trembling. "This is the date Celestia went missing?" Jeremiah nodded. "The day she was loaded onto the transport vehicle, pregnant, 7 weeks along. And the person who signed for it was Redford. He took full responsibility for Celestia's and her unborn child's safety." She placed her hand on Storm, her eyes locked onto the crescent-shaped mark on his chest. An unmistakable sign. She didn't need to test it. She had known deep inside for a long time. He wasn't just a lost dog that happened to wander by. He was the surviving legacy of trauma, proof of a failed system of ambition and corruption. And also, a miracle. "So if Storm is Celestia's son," she whispered, as if speaking to herself, "then I don't possess him. I've protected him from the one who lost his mother, a man who doesn't deserve to keep any life." Jeremiah gripped her shoulder, for the first time, his old hand steady, as firm as an oath. "We won't let him take Storm again." Lily stood nearby, her eyes shining with emotion never seen before, her voice quiet but strong as the faith returned. "We have evidence, we have the truth, and we have Storm. No one can extinguish real light," Cole added, looking at his father with a respect he had never shown before. "Not again." In the quiet corner, Storm didn't bark, didn't move much, but his eyes glowed with something deep, something profound. It was as if he knew that he was no longer the nameless dog in the rain of years past, but the final piece of a story never before told to its end. He was still Storm, the friend, the healer, the witness. But now, he was also living proof. As the first sunlight of the new day shone on the papers lying on the table, illuminating every faded word, Jennifer knew they were no longer standing in the dark. The coming fight would not be easy, but this time, they likely wouldn't be fighting alone. Before the morning light could penetrate the tarp covering the booth, Storm shifted. It wasn't a loud sound, no intrusive noise, just a strange draft slipping through the door crack, enough to make him raise his head, ears standing, and step slowly forward. In the quiet darkness, Jennifer sat motionless on the folding bed, her hand resting lightly on Storm's knee, as if by habit, or a tether connecting her to reality after a long, restless night. The door opened softly, and in the dim light appeared Travis Redford. He didn't look like the son of a famous tycoon. His shirt was wrinkled, his shoes muddy, and dark circles under his eyes. He probably hadn't slept. Perhaps he had just truly awakened. Storm didn't growl. He simply stood between Travis and Jennifer. 1 second, then 2, his gaze never leaving the man who had just entered, until Travis extended his hand, slowly, palm up, without a hint of threat. The dog sniffed briefly, then backed away, returning to Jennifer's side and lying down. Not because he had trusted, but because he understood. "Why have you come back?" Jennifer's voice was hoarse from lack of sleep, but still calm. Travis swallowed. "I need to talk, before everything goes too far, and I need to do what's right." Cole stepped from behind the curtain, his gaze full of suspicion. "I thought you were part of this plot." "Maybe I was," Travis admitted, not avoiding anyone's eyes. "But Storm saved me, and I betrayed that by staying silent. Now, if I don't speak up, I'll betray myself once again." No one interrupted. Everyone listened quietly, as though standing at a crossroads of fate. "My father," Travis began, his voice cracking slightly, as though stepping over a threshold he hadn't dared approach for years. "He didn't just plan to sue. He's planning to sabotage tomorrow's performance. A shock. Sound, lights, maybe even electric fireworks will be set near the judges' area. The goal is to create a panic situation, making Jennifer lose control in front of the crowd." Jeremiah gripped his cane tightly, lips pressed together, his aged face taut like a stretched bowstring. "After that, he'll use the footage to accuse Storm, saying that he reacted improperly, dangerously, that he's not fit to be a service dog. He's paving the way to seize Storm right after the test, papers in hand, and a few convinced animal control officers in tow." Jennifer clenched her fists, her fingers turning white. Storm nudged her knee gently. No need for words, no need for reassurance, just a familiar touch, pulling her away from the storm brewing inside her. "And when did you learn about this?" Cole asked. 2 days ago, I overheard a call." Travis produced a small recording device. "But I knew. If it's just my word, it won't be enough. So I dug through everything I knew. I remember when I was 19, my father tasked me with overseeing a test hunt near Timber Ravine. When they returned, someone in the group said they had seen a dog with a strange coat, a crescent-shaped mark on the chest, just like Celestia's." "And you kept that secret?" Jeremiah asked coldly. "I was afraid," Travis admitted, his eyes lowering. "Afraid of my father, afraid of getting dragged into his plan. But then a year later I was stuck in a flood. The rain was heavy, the water rose quickly, and I was stuck on a high rock outcrop with no phone signal, no lights, and no one knew where I was." He paused, eyes red. "Storm came. I don't know from where or why. He crawled through the mud, offered his collar for me to grab, and pulled me out of the water. Then he didn't leave. All night he blocked the wind for me, didn't sleep, didn't eat. I'm alive because of him." No one said anything. The tent felt still, as if the past and present had layered on top of each other, vividly. "My father doesn't know about that," Travis said. "I didn't dare tell him. But now I'll tell the board, and the media, if necessary. I'll testify that Storm is a free entity, not owned by him, and that he had a chance to protect Celestia, but he abandoned the breed in pursuit of profit." Lily stepped forward, her eyes glistening with tears. "Are you sure? He's your father." "Not all those who give birth to us deserve to be called family," Travis whispered. "Storm did what my father never did. Keep his promise, not with words, but with actions." Jennifer looked at Travis for a long moment. Then she nodded. "You can save not just him, but something greater." Storm stepped closer to Travis, raised his head, and gently sniffed his hand as if confirming something. Then he licked the back of his hand. Just once, slowly and deliberately. Not exactly forgiveness, just a quiet way of acknowledging the truth. "Tomorrow," Jennifer said, standing up, "we're not just performing, we're fighting." She placed her hand on Storm's head. "For the truth, for loyalty, and for the dog who saved more than just one life." As Travis's warning ended, the air in the booth thickened with unprecedented tension. Outside, the sky was still dark, the light of dawn not yet reaching the edges of the tent, but inside, Jennifer's gaze was clearer than ever. Not the look of someone ready to give up, but that of a warrior preparing to stand again. Storm sat beside her, silently agreeing, his amber eyes fixed on her face, unwavering. It was those eyes, an unwavering light without words that urged her out of panic, taking her first step into a fight not for victory, but for the truth that deserved to be heard. "We're not just defending anymore," Jennifer said, her voice steady yet firm. "We're counterattacking." Cole placed the stack of documents Jeremiah had brought onto the folding table. The old, frayed pages now neatly arranged next to DNA comparison copies from the emergency lab. Jeremiah stood quietly, his old eyes still shining with the fire rekindled after many years of ashes. Travis, for the first time in his life, didn't hide in his father's shadow, but stood tall with his courage, nodding lightly. He would be a witness. Storm, as if sensing the group's momentum, left his spot and walked toward the center. No command, no training needed. He simply stood there, his sturdy frame like a wall, his eyes deep, as though carrying the weight of untold history. "We can't stop him from trying to cause trouble," Cole said. "But if it happens right in front of the judges, and Storm doesn't react in panic, doesn't act aggressively, that behavior will be the clearest defense." Jennifer nodded slowly. "We can't stop a storm, but we can guide through it." The plan began to take shape. During the performance tomorrow, Jennifer would guide Storm through a series of simulated everyday situations, but with a script already prepared for unexpected interventions. They guessed Redford would choose a shock, breaking glass, metal clashing, or some other sudden event to trigger a PTSD reaction. Instead of avoiding it, Jennifer would welcome that moment, letting panic emerge, and Storm, as he had many times before, would be the anchor to help her through. Lily suggested filming the entire performance from multiple angles, which could be used as evidence if Redford tried to distort the truth. Travis volunteered to stay near the judge's area, ready to intervene if his father crossed the line. Jeremiah prepared the comparison documents, and Cole worked with the veterinary staff and the event organizers to ensure Storm wouldn't be subjected to unauthorized testing before the end of the competition. The sky began to brighten through the thin tarp of the booth, casting a honey-like glow on Storm's thick, strong coat. He lay still, his head resting on Jennifer's leg, as though he had understood everything they had planned, and chose to stand with them, not just by instinct, but by a choice rooted in trust. "When it begins, I can't guarantee I won't react for real," Jennifer said softly, her hand brushing between Storm's ears. "But I know you'll be here, and that's enough." No one answered with words, but the way they looked at each other, and then at Storm, was enough to know. The next morning would be a battle, not with guns, but with the connection between a soldier carrying invisible wounds and a dog who didn't need training to understand what she needed. And if Redford thought he could control the outcome with tricks, he had forgotten that there are instincts that cannot be manipulated, and souls that have been broken will know when it's time to rise. That morning, amidst the frantic preparations, Storm remained unchanged, unworried, unhurried, only a rare calm in creatures who know what loss feels like and still choose to believe that life still has something worth fighting for. They would enter the arena not just to compete, but to prove one thing. Sometimes the truth doesn't need to scream. It just needs to stand there, quietly, like Storm, and make everyone look directly at it. The morning unfolded exactly as planned, with not a second to spare. Each member of the team was in position, every gaze focused on a single point, the gate leading to the center of the performance arena. And there, Jennifer and Storm stood waiting, silently, as if listening to the rhythm of each other's heartbeats. The stadium was packed, with no empty seats to be seen. The rows along the bleachers, the steps leading to the VIP area, and even the corridors behind were filled with people. The warmth of the crowd blended into the air, slowly fading the underlying hum of tension. But beneath Storm's pause, the ground remained solid, as if all the disturbances outside couldn't reach the quiet space between him and Jennifer. A voice rang out from the loudspeakers, prolonged and formal like the sound of a trumpet. "The next performance is by the final contestant of the championship, representing booth number 29, Jennifer Whitaker and Service Dog Storm." Scattered applause rose, then grew louder, stronger, spreading like waves across the sea of people. But Jennifer didn't focus on the sound. She only looked at Storm. "Ready?" Not as a command, but as a promise. Storm raised his head, his eyes answering with his solid presence. And then they stepped forward. Not hastily, not dramatically, just two souls that had once been broken, now standing together in the world. From the very first step, Storm showed his difference. He didn't move like a trained machine, but as though listening to every subtle movement from Jennifer. When she leaned, he adjusted. When she paused longer than usual, Storm didn't push, didn't become anxious. He simply stood waiting, his gaze following her like a living map. The familiar tests were presented, retrieving dropped items, assisting with door openings, and responding to simulated medical alerts. But beneath Storm's pause, each action wasn't just a task. It was a deliberate gesture, carrying breath and emotion. He didn't do it because he was taught. It was as though he was protecting something far more important than his own life. From the judge's area, Thomas Granger leaned forward, his gaze never leaving the coordination between Jennifer and her dog. He didn't take notes, didn't exchange words with his colleagues. He simply watched, like someone listening to a rare symphony where each note was woven from the rhythm of understanding. No commands were issued, no leashes or slogans rang out, only the pure connection between two souls. Then suddenly, a clattering noise erupted from behind. A metal stand collapsed, creating a sharp, cold sound like the clink of shell casings on concrete, an audible crash that could tear apart anyone who had survived the war. Jennifer froze. Her shoulder jerked, her eyes wide, her breath unsteady. The familiar Storm began to rise from her memories. But she wasn't alone. Storm immediately turned. No waiting for orders. No need for verification. He touched her leg, gently but decisively. His eyes lifted to meet hers, like a tether between the one about to fall into the abyss and the grounding truth that the earth was still there. Jennifer placed her hand on Storm's head, her palm trembling but gradually steadying. They stood in the arena with no words, no elaborate movements. But the entire audience held their breath, because they were witnessing something beyond a competition. A primal act, a loyalty that no one could program, a soul saving another. Storm led Jennifer to a chair by the edge of the arena, pressing his body against her leg, his weight providing stability in a way only a deeply empathetic dog could apply correctly. And there, in the quiet waiting of hundreds of people, Jennifer's breathing slowly calmed. A small child in the audience began to quietly cry, and the mother placed a hand on the child's shoulder as if to say, "Those are tears for something beautiful, not for fear." Then applause began, slowly, sincerely, not for the performance, but for the journey those two survivors had walked. At the judge's podium, Granger glanced at a colleague and quietly nodded. In the VIP area, Chuck Redford stood frozen, his mouth tight, his eyes burning with the look of a man seeing his plan countered with something he could never reach. Loyalty that cannot be bought, and love that cannot be trained. Storm never took his eyes off Jennifer, and amid that crowded stadium, they had made the entire world around them seem irrelevant. It was just survival, trust, and one undeniable truth. Storm didn't need to be owned. He needed to be seen. As the final moments of the performance played out like a silent symphony between two souls, a loud noise suddenly tore through the stillness. Metal hit the floor, creating a sharp, clear sound, like a shell casing dropping. Just as Storm had led Jennifer to the pivot point in her performance. An equipment stand behind the judge's area had toppled over, whether intentionally or not, no one could verify, but its effect was undeniable. Jennifer froze. At that moment, the stage lights dimmed, and the surrounding murmurs blurred into a ringing in her ears. She no longer stood in a competition. She had returned to a battlefield. The smell of gunpowder and gray smoke flooded her mind, the crackling calls over the comms, the groaning, the running, the commands. A space of memory she had tried to bury deep in her consciousness now rose like a violent wave. But Storm was not in panic. He didn't bark, didn't overreact like many dogs who had never experienced human trauma. Storm turned toward Jennifer, looked into her eyes, then moved right up beside her. No command was given, no gesture directed. He simply knew, because that was what he was born to do. Storm pressed close to her, not crowding, not pushing, just standing there, as he had during hundreds of Jennifer's nightmares. Quietly, persistently, close enough for her to feel the warmth of his coat against her hand, heavy enough for his breath to form a real rhythm in a world that was spinning inside her head. Jennifer's trembling hand reached out. He raised his head, resting his forehead gently in her palm, as though willingly becoming the final anchor. An action not taught, not in any training manual, just the result of years spent side by side, an instinct honed not in the training yard, but in the silent moments between the night and the pain. The audience held its breath. Not a sound broke that moment. Those who had once doubted, who had once seen her as unfit, now no longer saw a performance. They were witnessing a salvation unfolding before their eyes. And the one doing it was a dog, not with a leash, not with commands, and not needing anyone's recognition. Slowly, bit by bit, Jennifer's breathing began to steady. The darkness didn't fully lift, but enough for her to see the brown-black head resting on her knee. Storm didn't look at the audience, didn't care about the judges. His gaze was only on one person, the one he had chosen to stay with, despite the past or the consequences. And then, when Jennifer nodded slightly, signaling that she was okay, Storm took a half step back, not retreating, but making space for her to move forward if she chose. That proactive freedom, like a gentle reminder. He was here, but the choice was hers. Jennifer stood up, not perfect, not strong like a warrior, but firm like a person learning to trust the present again. She didn't speak, just placed her hand on Storm's head, and together they continued the rest of the performance, no longer like performers, but like two beings who had survived the battlefield, through a connection no one could fake. From the judges' area, Thomas Granger stood still. He didn't take notes and didn't speak with anyone. He simply watched, not as a judge, but as someone who had just witnessed something sacred. Because even amid the smoke and dust of life, amid all the schemes and pretenses, there are moments so real that one cannot turn away. As soon as Jennifer and Storm completed the final step of their performance, the atmosphere in the arena hung heavy with the lingering echo of a moment so real, so human, that the air seemed to stand still. But then, a sudden movement from the judges' area snapped everyone's gaze in that direction. Travis Redford emerged from backstage, his face tense but resolute, clutching a worn brown folder. Inside it, the truth his father had buried for so many years. He walked straight to the judges' table, where Thomas Granger had not yet sat down, placing the file before him and saying something in a low but firm voice. Granger opened the folder, flipping quickly through the pages, the original registration copy of Celestia, genetic records, the delivery report signed by Chuck Redford, along Travis's handwritten statement confirming everything that had happened, including the accident that led to Celestia's disappearance and the relentless pursuit of Storm in the years that followed. A brief, taut silence enveloped the judging panel. Then Granger looked up, his eyes sharp as a blade freshly drawn from its sheath, sweeping over the VIP area where Chuck Redford sat, his face contorted with barely concealed fury. Without needing a microphone, just with a nod of authority, Granger signaled to security. A brief announcement echoed through the stadium's PA system, but the voice of the announcer trembled with the unfolding situation. The results announcement will be temporarily delayed for an urgent internal investigation related to an official complaint and legal documentation presented by witness Travis Redford. A murmur spread like wildfire. The audience turned to one another, whispering. Some jumped to their feet. Those in the dog training and competition circles, upon quickly scanning the screen showing Celestia's name and Jeremiah Cole, a name once legendary, now faded in the old records, began to piece together what was happening. Outrage quickly erupted as they connected the dots: the mysterious disappearance, the buried bloodline, and a dog with no record suddenly becoming a phenomenon. Chuck Redford, still sitting, his face twisted in anger, shot to his feet, shouting, "It's mine! I have the ownership papers." But no one wanted to listen to him anymore. Whistles of protest, cheers, and angry shouts rose from all corners of the arena. It was no longer just a competition, but a stage where truth and lies were drawing the final line. Thomas Granger raised his hand for silence. When he spoke, it was no longer the voice of a judge, but of a man upholding justice. During today's competition, we didn't just witness a performance, but a living testimony of loyalty, extraordinary empathy, and a bond that transcends all barriers between human and animal. At that moment, new evidence was presented to the organizing committee, proving that the dog named Storm, the contestant who just completed the performance, is the legitimate descendant of Celestia, a dog owned by Mr. Jeremiah Cole, who has been deeply harmed by a conspiracy of concealment for nearly a decade. He turned to Jennifer, still standing in the middle of the arena, her hand resting on Storm's head, her gaze unwavering from the dog who returned her look with the usual calm. "Therefore," Granger declared, "all legal claims regarding the ownership of Storm will be temporarily suspended for investigation, and he will remain with the person who has protected him for the past 5 years, Ms. Jennifer Whitaker." The crowd erupted. Cheers, applause, and loud, unrestrained shouts filled the air as people stood, raising fists or shedding tears. Lily burst into tears, rushing to embrace Jeremiah outside the fence. Cole stood close by, his shoulders shaking with the weight of relief. Storm did not react. He simply nudged his head gently into Jennifer's side, as though reminding her that the conclusion wasn't here yet. He was still on duty, to protect, to support, to be present. And then, Granger looked up again. Finally, with the unanimous consent of all judges, the first prize for the Special Services category today goes to Storm and Jennifer Whitaker, not just for their performance, but for the truth they have brought. A truth that cannot be trained, cannot be bribed, and cannot be destroyed. The entire stadium stood. Amidst the chaos of life, they had witnessed something pure, and that something came from an old soldier with scars still etched deep in his heart, alongside a dog with no papers but carrying the legacy of a breed capable of love, sacrifice, and healing. After the final applause of that fateful day, after the stage lights dimmed and the soft sighs of relief echoed in the backstage halls, a year passed. The peaceful surroundings of suburban Texas were now replaced by the steady rhythm of life at a place with a new name, but built from the oldest things in Jennifer's life. On the freshly painted wooden gate, the sign read, "Whitaker Cole Training Center, where the heart finds its way home." There, in the wide, wind-blown field, Storm, the once collarless dog, became the soul of a healing community. Not a decoration, certainly not a symbol to be adorned, but the living embodiment of why this center existed. Veterans returned, bringing eyes drained of trust and hands once clenched around weapons but now unwilling to hold anyone, meeting Storm and dogs like him. Not to be served, but to be seen, to be felt, to be understood. Jennifer, at the age of 60, no longer carried the closed-off demeanor of someone who had retreated from the world. Her face was still marked with the lines of war, but her eyes had softened, her voice slower to listen, and every step down the wooden hallway of the center was accompanied by the footprints of Storm beside her. He remained calm as always, but now he had a patch of grass to lie on after every training session, a small bell hanging by the door. Every time he brushed it, it was a signal that someone new needed to be welcomed. Travis now managed the center. He no longer wore his luxury watch or perfectly pressed suit, but instead faded jeans and boots caked in dirt. His redemption didn't come from words, but from every diligent action every day. Fixing pipes, checking the list of dogs due for health checks, and especially cleaning the kennels every night. Cole was in charge of medical exams and clinical training programs, while Jeremiah, though older, never absent, led the first pairings between veterans and dogs assessed for high empathy instincts. Storm no longer performed in competitions, but every day he had a special mission: to enter the first session of every therapy cycle with Jennifer and quietly sit among the circle of people, trying to steady their trembling hands and voices. His steadfast presence was what allowed them to drop their guard, one step at a time. No slogans, no orders, just a gaze from amber eyes that everyone could feel. I understand. There was a woman named Nina, a former Marine with a large burn scar on her face that had once made her flinch when looking in the mirror, who shared during her first therapy session that she couldn't remember what it felt like to be touched by someone without fear. But when a dog named Rio from the shelter approached and sat by her, gently nudging her thigh as if the scars had never existed, she burst into tears, not from pain, but from realizing she was still human. At that moment, Storm stood quietly in the corner of the yard, like a teacher watching his first student begin to pass on the flame. He didn't need to intrude. Healing had begun to spread, just as he had always trusted. No forcing, just being present at the right moment. Every evening, when Lily, now 16 and a training assistant, sat on the porch to record the journeys of each pair, Storm always lay next to her, his head resting on her leg, eyes half closed. The girl who had once cried uncontrollably at the competition now spoke with confidence, her hands steady when holding the leash, her heart strong enough to teach others how to soften in the presence of a dog needing a second chance. Jennifer sometimes stood back, watching, then turned into the house, pausing before the photo hanging in the hallway. A photo of her and Storm during that moment on stage, amidst the applause, between two panes that had just been laid down. The photo said nothing, but every time she looked at it, she remembered, not the memory of failure, but the moment she chose to keep living. A year passed, and no one mentioned Redford anymore. The lawsuit was closed, but Celestia's true legacy lived on in the steps of Storm and his descendants, each carrying with them the most important quality, the ability to quietly empathize. The center had no ranking system, only a small wall near the exit, where each veteran, after completing the program, wrote a thank you note, sometimes just simply, "I can breathe again." The Storm passed by every day, sometimes stopping as if to read, or just feel what people needed to learn in a lifetime. Sometimes, healing doesn't come from medicine, but from a gentle touch at the right moment, and eyes that know how to wait without forcing. From what was once an old porch amidst dust and memories, the Whitaker Cold Training Center has now become a landmark. Not just on the map for dog lovers or professional trainers, but in the hearts of veterans who once believed they could never find the light again. And at the heart of that circle, where all paths converged, was Storm, still walking alongside Jennifer, though his steps had slowed. From the beginning of their journey, each of them had moved through loss in their way. Lily, the girl who once clutched her grandmother's hand with tearful eyes, now walked confidently in the training yard. She didn't shout orders, didn't demand. She listened, then adjusted the rhythm of the veteran's breath to match that of the dog quivering at the touch of stiff hands. Lily didn't just teach how to walk a dog. She taught the veterans how to open their hearts, because she had witnessed Storm open his to a woman who thought she had closed hers forever. Travis, who had once been swallowed by his father's shadow, found his way not through triumph, but through service. In the early days, still clumsy with schedules, paperwork, and facilities, Travis had now become so skilled that even the smallest detail was second nature. He knew when to adjust the temperature in the kennels when a new dog showed signs of anxiety and needed to be placed near Storm for comfort. No one mentioned his past. No one needed to forgive him, because Travis had forgiven himself through staying and building. Jeremiah, though his health was no longer what it used to be, still came to the center every morning with his well-worn notebook. Under his guidance, the Celestial Breeding Program, now known as a line of dogs not just inheriting rare genes, but also living in an environment of love and empathy, had begun to bring forth its first litters. They weren't trained by command, but grew up in love and observation, learning empathy not through force, but through time and trust. Storm, though no longer the lead dog in the training yard, remained the standard by which Jeremiah measured the development of each new generation. Cole, once the veterinarian who administered shots and vaccinations, was now the emotional pillar for both the people in recovery and the dogs learning to connect. He was the one who checked the gaze, the heartbeat, and the sleep of each dog in the center. Because, as Jennifer had once said, sometimes a misplaced glance could speak more than 100 lines of data. And Jennifer, no longer a shadow retreating to the end of the road, had become a symbol. She didn't need to stand before a camera or take the podium. She was the one people turned to when they faced difficulties. Because in her, they saw something no one could teach: the endurance to persist through days when no one else stood beside her, and the trust unshakable as stone in a dog with no papers, no collar, but enough patience to keep a person alive in the dark. Storm, now 7 years old, his muzzle graying, but his gaze as steadfast as the first day, no longer needed to run. He just needed to lie quietly next to the new person, press himself against them when they trembled from a memory that had just resurfaced, then gently retreat when he felt their breathing stabilize. He didn't need commands. He just needed to be present. And he still understood every gaze, just like that first time when he waited for Jennifer at the edge of Timber Ravine on that first rainy night. The flame that was lit by what seemed like a chance meeting now burned in every step, every glance, every gesture that no one could see except those who had been through the darkness. No award ceremony was enough to honor what they did. But every day, when a veteran smiled for the first time in years, when a dog wagged its tail because it realized it had been chosen when Storm pressed his head into someone's shoulder and that person stopped clenching their fear, it was a reward. As the evening light spilled over the training yard, Lily stood beside Storm, adjusting the leash for a newly arrived veteran. On the other side of the fence, Travis was calling Jennifer to let her know that the center had been nominated for a Community Mental Health Award. Jeremiah was leading a new puppy into the clinic, and Cole was turning on the lights behind the kennels to check the temperature. And Storm, just like every day, stood in the middle of the yard, turning his head to look for Jennifer. When she stepped out onto the porch, he walked toward her, not quickly, not slowly, just as always. One glance, a deep breath, and exhaled lightly. That flame now was no longer a life-saving fire, but a guiding one. And Storm, still holding it high. The sunset bathed the trees around the center in golden hues, the last light of the day stretching across the red-tiled roof, seeping into every crack in the wooden doors, reflecting faintly in the puddles of rain left after a light afternoon storm. Jennifer stood on the porch, her hand lightly resting on Storm's head, now a true elder, yet still carrying the same steadfast demeanor and intelligence that never faded. Down in the yard, some new veterans were taking their first wobbly steps beside dogs they had never met before. A man with a long scar on his cheek was awkwardly handling a leash. A young woman, her left arm visibly trembling, sat motionless beside a puppy, her eyes as though listening to a call deep within her chest. Jennifer didn't need to ask to know what they were going through. She had been there, once thinking that the darkness was all that remained. Storm lifted his head, his ears twitching as he heard the first tentative laugh, soft, uncertain, but real, from one of the new arrivals. He slowly moved, leaving the porch and crossing the sun-dappled yard. No need for Jennifer to signal, no need for anyone to call. He just knew, just as he had always known, where his presence was most needed. Jennifer walked behind, her steps slow but steady. On the way, she greeted Cole, who was making notes at a table outside, nodded at Lily, who was guiding a group of new trainees, and smiled at Travis, who had just finished hanging the new wooden sign carved with the center's motto, "Here, hearts are allowed to begin again." When they neared the training area, Storm had already chosen his person to sit beside. It was the woman with the trembling arm, her eyes still filled with doubt. He didn't touch her, didn't try to make her play. He simply sat there, his gaze gentle, his presence complete. And then, when the woman unconsciously reached out, slowly, hesitantly, Storm lowered his head, resting his cheek in her palm as though whispering, "I'm here." Jennifer stopped a few steps away, her hands clasped in front of her, her eyes teary yet calm. How many times had she seen Storm do this, never repeating like a command, but always to the right person, at the right time. He never tried to heal anyone. He only existed as a commitment that no one would be left behind. Perhaps that was what made Storm more special than any dog she had ever known. He didn't try to be a symbol, didn't need anyone to call his name. But where there was a crack in someone's soul, there he would quietly step in and stay. No fanfare, no demands, just offering steadfastness like the earth. "He doesn't need anyone to teach him," Jennifer whispered as if speaking to herself. "Just someone to listen." Behind her, Jeremiah had just come out of the new breeding area, holding a small gray puppy, its big eyes clear as glass. Cole chuckled softly. "One of Storm's pups. It has the habit of staring at strangers as if measuring their heartbeat." Jeremiah nodded. He didn't learn that. He inherited it. The celestial line was no longer just a special bloodline. It had become a living symbol for empathy without command, loyalty without control, and hope reborn in broken souls. And the one who kept that flame burning had never moved from his place. Storm still sat beside the woman, his head resting against her hand, eyes closed, as if assured that she had made it through a first turn. Jennifer approached and sat down beside him, leaning into the familiar shape, just as she had many times before. At that moment, all the noise of the yard faded away. All that was left was heartbeat, breath, and something deeper than friendship, something that couldn't be named but could be felt when near. There was no ceremony to mark the end of their journey, and there didn't need to be, because Jennifer and Storm's story wasn't over. It continued in every new step, every uncertain pair of eyes beginning to find the light, every trembling arm supported by a gentle lick or a familiar nudge. They say that not everyone who wanders is lost. But with Storm, it wasn't that those without papers were ownerless. Some souls are born to keep the flame for hearts that are growing cold. And Storm, the nameless dog of so many years ago, was still guiding silently, steadfastly, among those who needed to be seen, needed to be believed, and needed to be loved. As the last light faded into the sunset, the wooden sign at the center gate became clear once again in the evening shadows. Whitaker Cole Canine Training Center, where hearts find their way home. And there, in every blade of grass swaying in the wind, in every footprint left on the red dirt path, in the gazes of newcomers and those who had once fallen and risen again, their story continued quietly, steadfastly, without show, like a flame that never dies, just like Storm. Perhaps in each of our lives we've had a moment like Jennifer's, when everything seemed lost, but then a small, quiet, and sincere thing pulled us back from the edge. For Jennifer, that thing took the form of a dog named Storm. But what about you? What or who has helped you rise amid the storms in your life? Share your story in the comments below, because you never know. Your words might offer hope to someone else. If this story has touched your heart, don't forget to like the video, share it to spread love, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next inspiring journeys. Thank you for walking this path with us.